Short break muna tayo sa politika dito sa atin para silipin ang isang giyera na nangyayari sa isang malayong sulok ng mundo. There's always two sides to any conflict. In this war in Ukraine, there's a side that we see and read about in the news. There's also the other side that we probably do not know much about. Let's start with a familiar story.
Russia invaded because it wants to recover its old empire. When the Soviet Union failed in 1991, lands that used to be part of the USSR became independent republics. One of them is Ukraine. These lands were part of Russia even before it became communist. Russia now wants them back, and that makes its neighbors very, very nervous. Lahat naman ng kwento merong kontrabida, and in this narrative, Russian President Vladimir Putin fits the image of an ambitious, dangerous dictator. He put his main political opponent in jail, and he is being blamed for the lethal poisoning of another critic who went on exile in the UK. He does not like being criticized in media, and the state-run Russia today is all Putin propaganda. Putin also likes to parade around half-naked, katulad ng isa ring diktador na kilala natin. And there are stories that he is corrupt and possibly one of the richest men in the world today. Parang katulad din ng isang diktador na kilala natin.
As I fulfill the duties of the President of the Russian Federation,
Putin is the archetype villain of many Hollywood spy thrillers. He is the enemy of democracy bent on dominating the European continent. That, at least, is the Putin we read about in the news. Now let's look at the other side of this conflict. We also begin this narrative with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. U.S. Secretary of State James Baker assured then-Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, will not move an inch eastward into former Warsaw Pact countries. Fast forward to the year 2022, Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states have all since become members of NATO. The final straw happened in 2014. The Ukrainian president friendly to Russia was overthrown in what is known as the Orange Revolution. Ukraine is not like any other countries that joined NATO. It is right next to Russia. It was unthinkable for Putin that Ukraine would become an ally of the United States and NATO. Putin saw this as a threat to Russia. Ukrainians loyal to Russia fought back in 2014. They took the eastern provinces. Russia seized Crimea, an important naval base since the time of the empire. Late last year, in 2021, Putin started moving troops to the border and gave a list of demands. Among them, a legal guarantee from the United States that Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. Putin also wants the United States to stick to the supposed assurance it gave Russia in 1991 that NATO won't expand to countries formerly allied with the USSR. Putin calls his demands legitimate security concerns and warned the U.S. to take them seriously. After all, the U.S. has the Monroe Doctrine in place since 1823, which says that no European power should ever try to move its military to any part of the American continent, the United States' so-called backdoor. The United States and Russia almost triggered a nuclear war in 1961 over missiles the Russians put in Cuba. Now it's Russia that wants the United States and NATO out of its front door. But the United States finds Putin's demands unacceptable. Ang tanong, paano naman ang Ukraine? What about its right to self-determination? Di ba desisyon naman nila kung sasali sila o hindi sa NATO? For this narrative, we go back further than the fall of the Soviet Union to the year 882, to the founding of Rus in what is today Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine all trace its history to Kiev and Rus. Ukraine, for much of its history, was part of the Russian Empire, and later the Soviet Union. When the USSR broke up in 1991, Ukraine became its own nation. Putin, the former KGB agent, believes it was American meddling that turned its close neighbor from being pro-Russia to being pro-America. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky was polling 30% satisfaction before the invasion. Zelensky's popularity is now hitting 90%. He has gone from situation comedy actor to president to wartime leader.
Тут. Всі ми тут, наші військові тут, громадяни суспільства тут, всі ми тут. Захищаємо нашу незалежність, нашу державу. І так буде й далі.
Putin probably thought that all he needed was to roll in his tanks and troops, and Ukrainians would welcome them as brothers. Military analyst Jose Custodio sees another reason the invasion seems to be failing.
The invasion force is actually outnumbered by the Ukraine army, no? Kasi the Ukrainian armed forces around nasa 200 plus thousand yan, no? And then plus reserves, syempre that's the entire manpower of Ukraine already. That was a highest estimate prior to the war starting, that it was 200,000 Russians surrounding Ukraine. O di kulang na kulang yun, no? Up against a force that is not badly equipped.
In short, poor planning or they miscalculated the resistance. The Ukrainian army is also receiving massive amounts of weapons from the United States. Custodio offers another theory.
The thing is that countries like Russia, which are led by autocrats, there's a pattern in military affairs, which is that you tend to have a military that is, number one, the result of patronage systems. Kung may patronage system yan, hindi yan merit. Diba? Hindi yan merit system.
Poor commanders, kumbaga.
If you have a character as strong as Putin, then your tendency is to have commanders under him who will be sucking up to that type of a leader.
Like this scene in which Russia's spy chief clumsily tries to respond to Putin's goading.
Мы об этом не говорим, мы этого не обсуждаем. Мы говорим о признании их независимости или нет.
Да, я поддерживаю предложение о признании независимости.
This was also far from the shock and awe invasion we saw in Iraq. Western media also hardly had any account then of the impact of the bombings of the United States on civilians. In contrast, this is probably the first TikTok war.
Нажимаем сцепление. О, и включаем первую скорость.
We all know that within that red are teams of Ukrainian anti-tank special forces, resistance groups, no? Madami, di ba? We're even getting footage of Ukrainians in occupied areas who are protesting or who are shouting at Russian troops or asking them, "Are you here? Go back to your place." No? So you can see that the Russians are not in effective control of the areas that they are in. And again, that goes to something is wrong. Sa simula, it was economically sa EU, di ba? They wanted more EU aid, but the pro-Russian president then didn't want to, so that's why he was overthrown. Then you had that Russian intervention, di ba? And because of that Russian intervention in 2014 and annexation, the Ukrainian armed forces drifted to the NATO and the US. And that was the start of intensive training by US units to Ukrainian forces.
Official yan?
Official yan.
Ukraine and Russia have a long history together. Their culture and their people have so much in common. But it is this invasion that Ukrainians for many generations will likely remember. Putin's move may have backfired. He may only have succeeded in driving Ukraine deeper into the arms of the United States and the West.
The moment Putin kasi started his war against the Ukraine, in all accounts, even if he won in the battlefield, he would still lose in the long run because of the isolation that would happen. And whatever is left of Ukraine would really veer towards the West already, if there's anything left in Ukraine.
Is there a Philippine angle to this story? Well, the easy answer is yes. Dahil tumataas ang presyo ng langis, Buong mundo naman apektado niyan. Apektado rin ang mga OFWs, pero hindi naman kadamihan. As for the war itself, Defense Secretary Delfin Lorenzana says the Philippines is neutral. At the same time, the Philippines voted for a United Nations resolution condemning the invasion. Professor Renato de Castro, who teaches at the National Defense College, says there is no contradiction in the two positions.
Notion of neutrality in international law is a legal condition that you declare yourself that you're not siding any of the belligerents. Usually countries will declare neutrality if you're in the vicinity, you're affected. Like for example, you're Switzerland.
Tama lang yung declaration of neutrality.
No need I think it's absurd because we're
Kasi
so far.
Layo naman natin.
Layo natin, oh.
Okay.
So far. Or if case ng US nung Second World War, well, because the United States was trading with all the belligerent countries, both in the First and Second World War. So nag-declare niya ng neutrality as much as possible the US wants to trade with all. Pero
Wala
hindi
namang
pwede.
contradiction yan, Prof, dun sa
Wala.
voting to condemn the invasion.
Sure. There's nothing.
There's no
nothing. Because the notion of neutrality is a legal status. Our vote is a moral position.
Okay, malinaw yan.
We condemn the action, but it doesn't necessarily mean we will side with the victim. We just condemn the action of the aggressor.
The fighting is far from us, but De Castro says it may influence events in our neighborhood.
The crisis in Ukraine will escalate. The focus of the United States will be, of course, in Eastern Europe. And this will give China the opportunity to pursue its aggressive intention vis-a-vis Taiwan.
Invasion drove Ukraine straight into the arms of NATO and the United States, but it is also driving Russia straight into the arms of China. Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping already announced what they call an alliance without limits.
This will also give China a possible model on how to deal with this problem with Taiwan. And the third aspect there is, of course, this will really push Russia into the arms of China, cementing what is called the Eurasian Security Partnership. It's not yet an alliance. It seems that China is becoming the winner. All the exports, raw material exports of Russia that are now being refused in the Western markets would have to be sold to China at a basement price.
A stronger China is definitely not good news for the Philippines and its claims on the West Philippine Sea. Most analysts see the next major conflict to happen in the Indo-Pacific region or in our part of the world. They see four major flashpoints: the Korean Peninsula, the Japan-China Maritime Area, Taiwan, and the West Philippine Sea. A war in a distant part of the world does not involve us, but it will affect events in our part of the world. The two world wars were, in fact, a result of a chain of events. An arms race is already underway. Everybody seems to be getting ready, just in case.
We are part of that arms race. We acquired brand new guided missile frigates from South Korea. We acquired a intermediate range ballistic missiles from India. So this will trigger a chain reaction in the Indo-Pacific region, which is actually more volatile than Europe a few months ago. Everyone is expecting that just in case you'll have a major conflict in the 21st century, everyone expecting that it will happen here.
A group of businessmen asked Professor De Castro to speak to them about the war in Ukraine. But they found Professor Renato De Castro's speech too scary, and they asked him to tone it down a bit. Professor De Castro ended up just asking to cancel. It's the job of an analyst and a historian to warn us about things that may come so that we can learn how to avoid them or that we can learn how to prepare for them.